The radio traffic had already turned tense when Brendan McDonough realized the mountain was no longer a place where a lookout could safely stay put. He was alone on a separate knob above the Yarnell Hill Fire, watching the country open beneath him in heat and smoke, while the rest of the Granite Mountain Hotshots worked elsewhere on the line. The brush below was thick chaparral, dry enough to burn hard and fast, and thunderstorm winds had begun to shove the fire in ugly new directions. On June 30th, 2013, the Yarnell Hill Fire in west-central Arizona killed 19 members of the Granite Mountain Hotshots. McDonough, posted away from them as a lookout, was the only one who lived. Before Granite Mountain hired him, McDonough had been drifting in the kind of life that can narrow a young man's future fast. In later interviews, he said he had been using heroin, had been in jail, and badly needed something that might pull him into discipline before he wrecked himself. He heard there was an opening with the Hotshots, showed up with a resume, and impressed Superintendent Eric Marsh enough to get hired. Granite Mountain gave him structure and men he came to love like brothers. The fire itself had started 2 days earlier after dry lightning struck west of Yarnell. Conditions across that part of Arizona were already primed for disaster. Extreme drought, high heat, low humidity, and the unstable weather that comes with the monsoon transition. On June 30th, the fire grew more dangerous as storms built, and outflow winds became stronger and less predictable. Granite Mountain had been working the blaze through the day, cutting line and trying to hold it in bad country broken by ridges, drainages, and brush-choked slopes. McDonough was assigned lookout duty because the crew needed eyes on the fire from a separate location. That assignment was meant to make everyone safer. Instead, it became the reason he was not standing with them when the worst came. By early afternoon, the weather was turning hard enough that even the lookout position was becoming dangerous. The official investigation says Blue Ridge Hotshots personnel drove Granite Mountain's lookout down to an old grader and left him there at 12:39 p.m., telling him to call if he needed a ride. Later, around 3:50 p.m., McDonough was taking weather observations when the fire to the north was making a stronger push. He began moving toward the grader. As he got there, Blue Ridge Superintendent Brian Frisbee came around the corner. McDonough loaded his gear into Frisbee's UTV, handed over his radio, and was told by his own captain that the crew had eyes on him and the fire, and that it was making a good push. Frisbee then radioed that the Granite Mountain lookout was with him and safe, and that they would probably need to move the crew's trucks. McDonough left, believing his crew was in the black, watching the fire from a safer place. That detail mattered because it shaped the survivor's experience in the most brutal possible way. McDonough was not the man who watched 19 friends die in front of him. He was the man who thought they were still safe while events were already sliding toward catastrophe somewhere below and beyond his sight. After he withdrew, Granite Mountain no longer had a posted lookout in a separate location. The investigation later noted that the crew never took explicit action to replace him after he was forced to pull back. Near the eventual deployment site, investigators estimated the fire front traveled 100 yards in about 19 seconds. As McDonough linked up with Blue Ridge and helped move vehicles, the main Granite Mountain crew was making decisions in a fire environment that had become fast, confused, and lethal. The official report says that by the time they reached their final position, they had less than 2 minutes between the first known radio transmission at the deployment site and the last one. Chainsaws could be heard. They were trying to improve the site, cut brush, and burn out around themselves to make the tiny patch of ground more survivable. Packs, tools, and fuel bottles were still inside the area. Some shelters were fully deployed, some only mostly or partly deployed. The fire that hit them was beyond what the shelters and protective gear could handle. Winds over 50 miles per hour pushed a deep, flaming front through the site, with flame lengths estimated at 70 feet and heat beyond human tenability. For McDonough, the disaster arrived first as radio confusion, and then as the kind of silence that becomes sickening, because it means the unthinkable might already have happened. 1 minute he was part of the movement to pull out, relocate, and keep working. The next, the men he had spent the season with were no longer answering in any way that made sense. He knew the country. He knew what that brush could do when wind hit it right. He also knew the crew he belonged to was elite, disciplined, and led by men he trusted. That combination, trust in them, fear of the fire, and the growing realization that something had gone terribly wrong was its own kind of torment. The fire overran the crew's position in a box canyon near Yarnell, and when rescuers finally reached the site, all 19 were dead. It was one of the deadliest wildland firefighter disasters in American history, the deadliest wildfire in Arizona history, and the worst loss of U.S. firefighters since September 11th. McDonough was left with a form of survival that did not feel like rescue. He had lived because he had obeyed orders and withdrawn from his lookout when that separate position became unsafe. He had done what a firefighter was supposed to do, yet when the fire was over, he was the only member of Granite Mountain still standing. In the days that followed, the world around him filled with vigils, funerals, photographs, and the repeated recitation of 19 names, while he was still trying to understand how an ordinary assignment on a hotshot crew had turned into this. He later spoke openly about post-traumatic stress and deep depression after the fire. The public memory of Yarnell often centers on the 19 because their deaths were so overwhelming, but McDonough's story is horrifying for a different reason. He survived the operational danger on the mountain, only to enter a long aftermath where survival itself became its own burden. He had to live with the fact that the men who had trusted him, trained him, and changed his life were gone in a single afternoon. No report could make that bearable. The official investigation could reconstruct terrain, weather, timing, radios, and fire behavior. It could say there was no indication of negligence, reckless actions, or violations of policy or protocol. But it could not answer the question that follows so many lone survivors. Why him and not them? In the years that followed, McDonough tried to turn survival into service. Arizona's Granite Mountain Hotshots Memorial State Park identifies him as the lone surviving member of the crew and notes that he later became a public speaker working with nonprofits, serving firefighters, police officers, veterans, and emergency medical workers. That does not erase the voices on the radio, the smoke building over Chaparral, or the knowledge that the 19 men he loved never got out. It only shows that Brendan McDonough survived more than the fire itself. He survived the aftermath. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.